Groupie moment.
Hello and welcome to episode 6 of the Kaiju Groupie Podcast. I am your host, Michael, better known around these parts as the Kaiju Groupie, and today I have a really great episode for you guys. I sat down with yet another very good friend of mine, Eric Neely, co-host of the Monsters vs. Men podcast. And this episode I've been looking forward to for a very long time. Eric is a fantastic guy. He's a fantastic host on his own show, and he has a whole lot to say during our conversation that I think you guys are really, really going to enjoy. But before we get into all that, I do want to do a little bit of housekeeping and read another Apple Podcast review. This review comes in from Grattan, co-host of the Giant Monster BS podcast. The title of the review reads, "Kind of Addictive." And the review reads like this. "This is a really great podcast. It's about loving Godzilla and being friends, which is a fantastic concept. Michael is an absolute professional and charismatic host. The show is all about positivity, and it's great to hear how these people can bond over their interests. Michael does a great job at making these discussions while keeping the spotlight on each guest. Within 2 or 3 episodes, this has become one of my favorite current podcasts. I'm excited to see this show continue. Grattan, Giant Monster BS, 5 stars." Well, thank you so much, Grattan. It was a blast working with you guys on your show. It was a lot of fun doing that episode with you guys a few weeks ago, and I look forward to what you guys come up with in the future. So before we get started, I just want to share a quick thought that during this conversation, both Eric and I got a little bit personal. We talked about sort of our life growing up. We talked about how we both came into this fandom at different times in our life and what this fandom actually means to us as people. Eric, I spoke about earlier today on Twitter before I started recording this intro. I really enjoyed this conversation with Eric because it's fascinating how he has come to appreciate and enjoy these films that we all love. And he's able to do so without the baggage of nostalgia. And we did touch a little bit on nostalgia, especially my nostalgia for these films, because as you guys already know, I've kind of grew up as a Godzilla and Kaiju fan throughout my life. And so it was really interesting to speak with Eric about how he didn't necessarily have that experience, and how as an older man it makes him sound really old, doesn't it? As a man in his 30s, like me, how he has grown to love and appreciate these films later in life, through the podcast and through just interacting with this community. And you can hear the sincerity in Eric's voice. You can hear the empathy in his voice, and you can hear really the love for this community in Eric's voice too. And I think that this conversation is going to be super important for everyone to listen to. There's a lot of information to take away from this conversation, and I'm really looking forward to you guys listening to it. But before we head into all that, I do want to mention that my audio, I was having some technical difficulties when recording this episode, and we did our best. I enlisted the help of a friend of mine, David, from the Kaiju Apostle podcast, to help me correct some of the audio. We did the best we could. It doesn't sound terrible, but I do kind of sound like I'm in a tin can. So ultimately, I admit that was user error on my part. I do apologize, but as per the usual, Eric always sounds stellar, and he sounds absolutely wonderful in this episode as well. So I hope you guys will enjoy it. I hope you guys will take something away from it. And without further ado, let's get into the episode. And we're back, and with me I have my good friend and the brains behind the Monsters vs. Men podcast, Eric Neely. Eric, how are you doing, good sir?
I am not doing too bad. Thank you for introducing me as the brains of the Monsters vs. Men podcast, Michael. I joke about this sometimes. Honestly, it is 100% a joint effort between me and Alex, but if someone is the brains, I'm happy to consider myself the brains and he can be the bronze.
I don't even know if I consider Alex the bronze.
he can be a pushover at times. We'll say that.
Yeah,
I influence him. I influence him, and then he gives in to my opinions and my ways.
I can see that because you just have that way about you to where you're able to convince practically anybody that your opinion is always right. But before we get into all of that, Eric, please take a few minutes and let everyone who does not already know who you are, basically just who you are, what you do, and let's go from there.
Sure. My name is Eric, and I am an English teacher from Kentucky. I started a podcast, and this is how Michael knows me. I started a podcast with my friend Alex, who has been a friend of mine since college. We started a podcast about a year ago called Monsters vs. Men, where we cover kaiju films, one movie at a time, one series at a time, and try to talk about them in some new and interesting ways. I'm a complete newbie to kaiju films, to monster films. I had seen, before our podcast, I had seen Godzilla 2014, Godzilla 98, and the original Godzilla 1954. But other than that, I had not seen a giant monster movie. Now, what I brought to the podcast was I consider myself a cinephile, and for most other people, they just call me a film snob, which is completely fine. I get it. There is this tendency to call anyone that likes, highbrow films, you could call them snobbish, and I get that. But that's the angle that I bring in. Whereas Alex, he is the fanboy. He had seen all of the Godzilla films before and loved just about every single one of them. So we have an interesting dynamic there on the show. But honestly, I have loved getting to know more and more people, and I've loved getting to know these films over the course of the past year. It's certainly been a fun ride and a great journey.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Now, there are a lot of podcasts out there that have a host, co-host sort of dynamic where one is the diehard fan and then one is the noob, right?
Yeah.
There's a ton of those out there, but what I find the most interesting about what you guys have done, or what I have seen and what I've heard, to some degree, is it fair to say, Eric, that you're becoming just as diehard a fan as even Alex, and probably even more so in some cases?
I think that is fair. I mean, in some films, I love more than Alex does at this point. And in some ways, like I am going even deeper into things. I was really the first to kind of dive into the Ultra series. I was diving into Ultra Q earlier this year just because as we were watching these Godzilla movies each week, I needed something to supplement my kaiju fix. So I dove into Ultra Q as that supplement. And then Alex decided, I need to jump in as well. So we've both been working our way through Ultraman. But yeah, I think at this point, honestly, like now we're in our Gamera series. And to be honest, I've enjoyed Gamera overall, I think, more than Alex has. So I've become kind of a fanboy in that regard.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. And one of the reasons why I was looking forward to this conversation the most was because up to this point, I've had a lot of folks on that have had some connection to these films in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah.
A lot of us came into this fandom as a child. We have a lot of nostalgia for it, but you don't have that. Right. And I find that super interesting as a 30-something-year-old adult. You've been able to critically look at these films in a way that maybe a lot of us can't, because a lot of us, it's safe to say that a lot of us, look at some of these films, with a very nostalgic eye.
Well, that's the goal, I think. And, I think hopefully I bring a little bit of that perspective. And I hope I bring a little bit of my kind of film snobbery perspective in as well. As an English major, English and Spanish literature double major in college, I think that kind of helped me, or not helped me, it forced me to become a bit of a snob. Though Alex was an English major as well. He just didn't ever care about any of his work.
Hang on. He was?
Yeah, but he never cared about any of his work.
Oh, okay. Well,
this is the guy who would procrastinate to turn a paper in, like an hour beforehand. And he still did good on his papers, of course. But he wasn't a serious. I was like the nerdy English major. You've got the English majors that become English majors because they just need a degree, and then you have the nerdy, like literature heavy English majors, and that was me. So that's how I kind of entered into my snob academic zone. But yeah, I don't have that nostalgia going into these films. But what I have found really interesting is that I think it is I think it's the campiness of these films, especially the campiness I find in the Showa era Godzilla films, that after I've watched them and I've stepped away from them, even for a couple of weeks, I start looking back on the ones that I wasn't as fond of initially. I start to look back on those and rethink them immediately. It's almost as if, even though I've only been exposed to some of these films for less than a year, I'm already starting to feel nostalgic, or that sense of nostalgia for some of those films, especially those Showa era films, which I find really interesting.
Yeah, for sure. Oh man, you're touching on something that's really fascinating to me. And so I'll ask you, has viewing these films in a more critical light affected the way you view other films outside of the genre? Or was it the other films you watched outside of the genre that affected these films for you?
So I think it's a little bit of both, right? Like, initially, it's the films that I watched outside of the genre that affected my initial viewings of the films. But as I start watching other films today, and I start trying to dabble my toes back into some films that I was watching, or some types of films that I was watching before we started this podcast, sometimes I start to think, this needs a little bit more campiness. This needs to take itself a little bit less seriously.
Right.
And I think it is that Godzilla tinted influence that I'm bringing into it. And it's just, I've been so exposed to these films over a year now that I can't help but see other films in that sort of light. And that's an issue. Whenever I start to see a film and I'm comparing it automatically, then that brings the film down a little bit for me. But it also tells me, like, maybe I was just looking at this certain film too highly because it was supposed to be artsy, or supposed to be prestigious, or it was supposed to win all these awards, and not just look at it for, all right, what is this film? How is this film entertaining me right now? Which is what a good Godzilla film does. Is it entertains me. It takes me to places in my imagination that I didn't know existed, and it just keeps me in that moment. It's something that I can return back to and enjoy for how sincere they feel. I'm thinking of films like Mothra versus Godzilla. Right. Mothra versus Godzilla has a ton of those campy moments, but I just love the way I can watch that film, and it just makes me feel comfortable in its sincerity, if that makes any sort of sense.
No, it makes perfect sense. And so I was sitting here thinking, when you were saying all that, I wanted to ask you, is there a film that you guys have covered or you've watched in the past that you revisit the most often? Because I know you alluded to needing that giant monster fix now because you now watch Ultraman, right? So is there a film that you have revisited just for the pure enjoyment?
I would say, I would say Terror of Mechagodzilla is the film that I have returned to most. I love Terror of Mechagodzilla, and I love Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Honestly, another one I would throw in there would be Ebra, Horror of the Deep.
Interesting.
Those three are the ones that I've returned to most, just because of how fun they are, how off the wall they are. Jun Fukuda, for all his flack that he might receive whenever you're comparing him to Honda, Fukuda made a fun film, right? Like, he can make a film fun. and I think that is demonstrated, especially in Ebra, Horror of the Deep. And I think Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla is Fukuda's best. These two films, though, what they do is they give us characters that are fully alive. They give us scenarios that, though they're off the wall, have color to them. and they really just make us feel comfortable rewatching over and over again. So those are the three.
They go beyond the what a lot of us in the fan base like to call monster wrestling.
Yeah.
So they in the films that you laid out there, I can think of interesting characters, an interesting storyline, lots of, especially with Terror of Mechagodzilla. There's a lot. I would argue there's a lot more quality action in Terror of Mechagodzilla than Mechagodzilla 74.
Yeah.
And
I would agree with that.
Yeah,
and I would say in general, like, still watching these films, it's not the monster action that gets me. It's really not.
Right. Because you don't have that nostalgia for that.
I don't have that nostalgia for that, but I also just, I don't know. That's not the part that's the most interesting to me. The part that's really interesting is the relationships between the characters. And I know that sounds a little bit cheesy in a sense, but what I mean is do I almost feel a sense of camaraderie with the characters themselves? One film that I overlooked the first time watching through with Alex was Son of Godzilla. Son of Godzilla, from a film snob's perspective, is a piece of trash.
Well, from a fan perspective, I've heard several people say it's a piece of trash.
Yeah, and from many fans' perspective, it is a piece of trash. And to be fair to it, and to be fair to those people, Manila, I can see people really hating on Manila. I mean, he does look like a giant turd, and it's such an interesting direction that the series goes in at that point. However, yeah, so you have Goro Maki, and he interplays so well with the crew, and he also has what's her name again? The relationship with what's her name? Rico, yeah. Rico in Son of Godzilla. Rico is an interesting character because she's playing. I would never think I would say this, but Son of Godzilla is Shakespearean in a sense because in the Tempest, you've got Prospero, and Prospero has this daughter, Ariel, and that's the same scenario that Rico finds herself in. She finds herself in the Ariel scenario from the Tempest, which is just a funny little connection there. But honestly, Son of Godzilla is a super fun adventure film where if you can just take the humor as like this slapstick sitcom sort of humor, you're going to have a really good time with it. Don't take it too seriously, and I think you'll be fine.
Yeah, I think because the franchise was going through sort of an evolution at that point. You know, Godzilla was becoming less popular, at least the version of Godzilla that we were seeing so far, like the very serious nuclear message Godzilla, that was becoming less popular. And at the time, I want to say Son of Godzilla was 1967. So at that time you had Gamera versus Gauss, and Gamera was being known for more kid friendly. So I want to say that maybe even Toho saw that, because if I'm not mistaken, Gamera versus Gauss was one of the more successful of the Showa era Gamera films. And so Toho wanted to replicate that, and they wanted to pull the attention of a younger audience, a more family conscious audience. And for some, a lot of people in the fan base don't care for that. There's a division among the fandom where it's, you want nuclear destroyer Godzilla, or do you want superhero family friendly Godzilla? And you see that transition sort of take place in Son of Godzilla, where he begins to then become, he gets the dad bod, and you get Manila or you get Minya, and then you get that transition into more superhero version of Godzilla.
Well, can I ask you a question about nostalgia,
Sure.
Michael?
Go ahead.
I know it's your podcast here, but now I'm going to ask you a question.
Sure. Go ahead.
When it comes to you and your nostalgia for Godzilla, where does that come from? Who introduced you really to Godzilla? And what films do you think rely most heavily on your nostalgia for them?
Okay. So my story with Godzilla comes from, I was 8 years old and I watched a marathon on television, the marathon that a lot of folks talk about on TNT, on the old TNT network. And the connection, the nostalgic connection I have with Godzilla was literally my parents. My parents introduced me to it because my dad, let me back up just for a second, because I was like a lot of kids at that age, 6, 7, 8 years old, big into dinosaurs, right? I thought I wanted to be an archaeologist, which I later learned was wrong. I wanted to be a paleontologist, not an archaeologist. And that kind of came from the fact that my dad, living here in West Virginia, and you're familiar with this from living in Kentucky, we have a lot of coal miners. And so growing up, I made the connection in my mind that my dad was an archaeologist because he dug up rocks. At least that's the very primitive connection I made in my mind as a child, right? So that played a little bit into it. My first exposure, my nostalgia comes from being this kid growing up. And I'm going to get a little bit personal and say that I didn't have a lot of friends growing up, right? I was sort of the kid that didn't really make friends well. Let's just say that, I was very shy. I was very quiet. Right. Mm-hmm. And so to me, Godzilla, Harryhausen, and some of these other science fiction fantasy films were an escape for me. And so I dove really deep into that stuff as a kid. And, it was really my parents who fostered that through me, because they saw sort of the joy that I got from it and sort of the creativity I got from it. Me playing in the backyard with dress, like I made my own Godzilla spines, my own Godzilla dorsal plates and my own tail and stuff like that out of cardboard. And they saw sort of the creativity that this franchise brought out in me. Right. And so they fostered that even more, they fed it. They really indulged me in that. And that is and those are memories that I'll have forever, because my parents are since gone now. I lost both my parents in the last couple of years. And I think that's one of the reasons why I've dove so deep into this fandom, is because of that nostalgia and those memories, because they bring me back to a very good place in my life where there wasn't a whole lot of chaos, and I was a little bit more carefree. It's a little bit different. We can both agree that 2020 has not been kind to hardly anyone. Right. And so it's sort of just an escape. That's what Godzilla was to me. And sorry, I said all that, and now I can't even remember the latter part of your question. What was it?
Well, my latter part of my question was, which film do you think has been most heavily influenced by your nostalgia, like your view on it?
Well, it's not the most popular film, but Raids Again. My earliest memory of Godzilla was Raids Again. I remember watching TNT or AMC. I can't remember now at this point what channel it was on. It was one of the Turner networks, I think. And seeing that film come on, and all I saw in the TV guide back when that was a thing was Gigantus the Fire Monster, which was the American title. And so that sounded really intriguing to me because, like I said, I was a huge fan of dinosaurs. I was a huge fan already of Harryhausen, and he did a lot of dinosaur films like Valley of Gwangi, 20 Million, The Beast from 20,000 Phantoms, and so on. And so that film probably is the one that I have the fondest memories of because it's one of my first. It's the one I have the earliest memories of. Probably the one that I have the deepest connection to, though, I would say it'd have to be Ghidorah, the three-headed monster, because I remember sitting on my dad's lap on the couch while he recorded that film for me and just being in awe of what I was seeing on screen.
Now, Michael, did you has it been just in the past couple of years that as an adult you've kind of dived back into this fan base then?
Since 2014. 2014 was the first little itch I got for being back into the fandom because, I saw 98 in theaters and I liked it. I later sort of grew out of love with it, to be kind. And we hadn't had any Godzilla films or any real kaiju films, not counting Pacific Rim, but any like what I would view as traditional kaiju films, like the stuff that I saw as a child. We hadn't had a whole lot of that at that point, right? And so when the trailers started hitting for Godzilla 2014, I got so excited. And then I remember watching the trailer, and at the time I wasn't married and I was sitting in my room, and my mom walks in and she says, "What are you watching? What is this?" And I said, "Oh, it's the trailer for the new Godzilla movie." And then that spun into an hour plus long conversation about me being a kid and her memories of me as a child liking this stuff, right? And so that's how I got started. Now, I didn't get real ingrained into the fandom. I've been really deep into it maybe for a little over a year. I started diving a little bit deeper into the Facebook groups. I started kind of digging around on Twitter, and that's how I met Travis, then David, and then you guys. And it's just sort of snowballed from there.
Yeah. No, I like what you say about how when you were a kid, your parents fostered this creativity within you through the Godzilla films.
Sure.
And I think lots of times our parents do that when they sense that we need it. Like my parents did the same thing for me, but it wasn't Godzilla films. It was any type of film. We used to have like Friday movie nights where we would always sit down, have some popcorn, make some homemade popcorn, and watch movies. And that's really how I fell in love with film. It was through my parents, through watching, and we wouldn't just watch like the latest like kids animated film. We'd watch anything. We'd watch anything. And that's honestly what started my love for film from a very young age.
I can get on board with that because I'm sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off, but I can get on board with that because in my house growing up, my dad, he loved Westerns, right? So John Wayne, Clint Eastwood, all of those guys were playing in my house. And I grew to appreciate older films at a very young age. But I got exposed to Gone with the Wind, Dances with Wolves, Dirty Harry, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. Just some really, really awesome films at a very early age. And I think that helped me appreciate some of these films now, because to me, they're not just guys in rubber suits.
Mm-hmm.
They're not just guys in rubber suits. They're not just cheesy pyrotechnics. They're not. They're, to me now, as a 33-year-old man, I see what the screenplay writers and the directors and the score writers and the actors and actresses are trying, the stories that they're trying to tell through these, what has been written off in the past as just silly nonsense.
And I think that's exactly the thing, Michael, right? Is as you and as I have kind of exposed myself to more and more of these films, I think there's a tendency that when we dive deeper into a subject, that sometimes it's easier to become cynical, right? To become, feel a little hollow towards the subject that we're kind of exploring. But for some reason, whatever it may be with kaiju films and kaiju media in general, the more that I have studied and watched these films, the more I find myself in awe and in wonder at how these films were actually made and put together. Right. The more I marvel at the craft of the filmmakers, of the special effects directors, of the cinematography. And the more in general that I'm just impressed that these films have this sense of comfort, as I said earlier, that they bring to them. It's hard to do. It's hard to manage that tone, but so many of these older Godzilla films do manage that tone in a way that makes me, again, feel that sense of comfort and nostalgia with them.
It's definitely comfort food. Definitely comfort food for a lot of us. How has sort of the dynamics in your home changed a little bit since, one, starting a podcast with your best friend and watching films that probably, at least for my wife, are viewed as silly? So and it helps that you have kids too. So I know Theo has really enjoyed all this. But how has the dynamics in your house changed a little bit by starting to get more involved in this fandom?
To be fair, Michael, my wife's not a cinephile. She's not a film snob. She was not in any way, shape, or form an English major. And she's not big into film in general. So honestly, like, the amount of time I spent watching other types of film, I wouldn't watch many other films with her in general. It's kind of just a hobby of mine already. So that part of it hasn't changed. Of course, there's a night every single week that I block off that I do my podcast with Alex. And there's also prep time that it takes to actually watch the film. And we try to take some notes and really think about the films that we're doing and put some work into effort into it. But honestly, it's been fun mainly in my family because of just how on board everybody has been. Neely, she knows when I do something. That's my wife. She knows when I do something, I throw myself into it. I don't do anything half-assed. Right? If I'm going to do something, I'm going to do it well. And that doesn't mean I'm going to be impatient by it. That doesn't mean I'm going to try to force something that's not there. But I'm going to put care and craft into the specific thing that I'm working on. And I may not be the best in every aspect. I'm definitely not. I've leaned on you, actually, Michael, for certain things. And I've leaned on Alex for certain things that are not my expertise. But I want to when I do something, I want to do it well. And honestly, I have a family that's very supportive of that. So they've been great along this journey. Has
being involved in this fandom and involved with the podcast changed you in any significant way?
Well, honestly, I honestly think it's been really good for me. And I think lots of people, when they look at the fandom, and this might be because they've been a part of other fandoms, I don't know. I see all the time online people just bashing Godzilla fandom. And I get it. Like, there are people in the Godzilla fandom that seem like jerks and seem like bigots, and they may be, honestly. I don't know most of these people. And I think the internet is just, it can be a very hostile and context killing place. But I think the fandom overall has been great for me. During this pandemic, I have been really holed up with my family. We've taken it pretty seriously. And honestly, it's been the connections that I've made within the community that has allowed me to maintain friendships, just to be blunt. And I've enjoyed these friendships. Some of these friendships that I've made in the community have been better than the friendships that I have with my coworkers, with the people that I work with some friends, with close friends that I had in high school and college, right? Some of these people I've gotten to know on completely deeper levels. And, I think one of the things, and just to get real and a little personal with you for a second, one of the things this fandom has offered to me is community. I had a couple years ago, I've had kind of I've had a perspective shift in kind of my spiritual and religious views. And I lost a lot of my community and a lot of my close friends because of that shift. And the Godzilla community, and just this community that we've kind of built through our podcast, has really offered me friendship where I may not have had that on that level before. And at the very least, it's offered me an excuse to talk with Alex, a longtime friend, every single week, which has been great.
Right. No, I totally get it. I 100% get where you're coming from, because if it was not for the friendships that I've made with guys like Travis, you, Alex, David, Nathan, and some others, I don't know how I would have remained sane, honestly. Now, granted, we've been pretty blessed, Lisa and I. Lisa's my wife. We've been pretty blessed in the fact that she works the healthcare field. She works at one of the major hospitals here in the area. So she's been busy. I have the opportunity to work from home for a creative agency. We do a lot of marketing for small businesses, nonprofits, and so they're always. I've been staying busy, basically. Yeah. But it's also made me very empathetic to people that don't have those opportunities. They're just basically held up. They're held up in their homes with no outlet to either express themselves or engage in a community. And I think that some of the shifts that you're seeing within this community are coming from a place of maybe a little bit of frustration, right? Mm-hmm. People have been held up for so long the last few months, and people are frustrated, right? But it's also given us an opportunity to sort of band together and communicate more with each other. I communicate more with people on Twitter, like you and Alex and some others, than I do with my own family members.
Yeah, and honestly, most of the time, it's not my friend's fault.
No, it's not. No.
I'm not always the best at reaching out myself, but I've noticed the same thing. It's really these people that I've kind of collaborated with, in a sense, to help build this little community that we've kind of created together. This podcasting community, really, that's been really neat to see how it's evolved, even in the past 6 months.
Yeah, it's a weird thing, really. If you step outside of it a little bit, and you think to yourself, okay, so this is a fandom about a guy in a giant lizard suit.
Yeah.
And then you think about it for a second, and then you question whether or not you still, whether you're insane for even sticking around.
Yeah, but it's not the thing.
Yeah.
That's the key.
Yeah.
Right? Is it's not the object of attention itself that's actually the most important.
Right. And
it's the friendships and the connections that we build.
But no, you're right. It's such a weird thing that we've built these friendships around such a very niche thing, right?
Yeah.
It's odd. It's really odd. Wow. Okay. So I lost my train of thought there. So you just got to give me just a second.
Good.
So I want to touch on a little bit more detail, the process that you go through when you evaluate some of these films. Like what are the key things that you're looking for when, say, Alex says, "Hey, we're doing X film this week." Walk us through a little bit of your process and see what does that look like when you're prepping for an episode.
Okay. So it starts by watching the film the first time through without taking any sort of notes and just trying to have an experience with the film, right? I actually try to turn my analytical brain off as much as possible that first time that I'm watching it. And I do that because I want to experience this film as I would if I wasn't on a podcast. I just want to see, will I enjoy this film without having to analyze it and overthink it a little bit? But then I go in a second time. And that second time, I'm looking for it. Well, it depends on the type of movie that it is, right? But I'm looking for a certain mixture of ingredients that I think make a good kaiju film. I'm also looking for a film that is that's going to balance its tones well. So a film that at times, though it may be like really serious, it can be comedic and it doesn't feel out of place. I'm also, as you know, if you've listened to our podcast before, which I know I thank you for listening to all of our episodes.
Once or twice.
Yeah. For our podcast, I'm looking for those standout moments that we use for our awards. So we talk about, our coolest character award, our that's a good shot award, I can't believe that acting award, standout effect award, and most memorable line award. So I'm looking for those as well. And then when it comes to making like a final evaluation of a film, and our films and our evaluations and our ratings are in no way, shape, or form definitive, though we like to joke that they are. Right. We take a look at everything that makes up a film. Right? We take a look at the soundtrack, cinematography, acting, but then there's also that intangible aspect that a director can bring. That can add to a score, that personal aspect as well. Actually, there's something I could run by you. You might think this is interesting. Okay. Whenever we're doing a podcast, we actually, at least for me, I try to go by these 5 like criticism credos of a film. And so would you like me to run these by you real quick? I want to know what you think about these.
I'll be honored to do that for you.
I haven't really shared these with anybody, but I think this is kind of what we try to do on our podcast. Sure. And the first one is this: it's be willing to enter into dialogue with those that disagree with you. You will never learn until you do. Right. And so like when it comes to our podcast, Alex and I may disagree, but we're willing to enter that dialogue. And honestly, I think this is the thing that Alex and I sometimes find ourselves surprised, that we get to the end of an episode and our opinions are not that far off from each other. We went into the podcast thinking we would have pretty opposing views on these movies, because we do, honestly, on other movies. We really are kind of opposites. But I think what happens is we end up having a true dialogue where we are open and willing to learn from each other. And so our opinions change a little bit based off each other's perspective, and we end up arriving at very similar places.
Right.
Do you see that?
I can see that, yes.
The number 2 one was try to be as unbiased as possible in your criticism, but always acknowledge that it's impossible to avoid bias completely. And so that's the other angle that we want to take a look at is Alex has seen these films lots of times. He's seen these films multiple times before. He does bring that nostalgia to it. And that's okay.
Right,
that's okay. Right. He's going to try to be as unbiased as possible. But at the same time, he knows that he is bringing some nostalgia to it. And he knows that he's bringing some bias to it. And that's fine. Right. Number 3 is never moralize your position. There may be a moral reason to like or dislike something, but that should never be made the rule for everyone. And I say this one because sometimes you hear like online, you hear like if you like this movie, you are fill in the blank, right? Or if you don't like this movie, you are fill in the blank. And it's like we're trying to moralize our opinions towards media, our opinions towards art. And to me, like you can enjoy something, you can even like think it has something to offer without fully being on board with its messaging, right? I think that's okay. That's okay sometimes. And we should never demean people for liking or disliking something.
No, absolutely not. No, I think that's probably one of the that's probably one of the worst quote unquote sins of the fandom right now is if you say I like let's say All Monsters Attack. I've grown to personally appreciate All Monsters Attack. You don't care much for it. But if I said that to the right person or a wrong person, however you want to look at it, I would be ostracized for that.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. And I mean, I've seen people take extreme positions. Like, you like All Monsters Attack, you support bullying,
right.
or like you like Shin Godzilla, you support Japanese nationalism. I just don't go that far in my criticism, right? There's just so much more context to it. Nothing in film criticism and our film enjoyment is ever that black and white.
No, it's not. Because there's the one thing that I really enjoy, particularly about Godzilla films, especially the Showa era Godzilla films. There's a lot of nuance to them. Like there's a lot more layers than what people like to give them credit for.
Yeah, no, I agree with that. My number 4 credo was always back up viewpoints, especially critical ones, with evidence. So if you're gonna be critical towards a movie, and I think this is pretty evident in we're finished up our Showa era Gamera films on our podcast, and so we just watched Gamera Super Monster, which has to be probably the most lambasted Gamera film of all time, and it's just hated. Like it seems to be universally hated online from the fans that I see, and I don't see it. I don't think that's fair. And most of the time, the conversation goes along the lines of Gamera Super Monster sucks because it sucks, right? There's no real evidence to back up,
right? Because then it becomes just when you start using language like non-descriptive language, like it just sucks or I hate it. That's an opinion, you're not stating facts at that point. You're not giving critical evidence. You're giving your opinion.
Yeah, which is fine. Like that's where film criticism starts. Like it all starts with your opinion. Like you can hate Gamera Super Monster, you can hate All Monsters Attack. That's fine. But if you're following, if you're recognizing your own opinion and your own bias, well, then you have a chance to take a look at the actual evidence. And you can actually support your view with evidence instead of just like bashing a film just based off 100% your feelings. Like actually take a step back, think about why you don't like something, and explain that. Like that's really what it comes down to, is an explanation of your likes and dislikes.
And it does not have to be this long, wordy, philosophical explanation. It just has to be something other than is hyperbole the right word to use here? Okay, it just has to be something other than hyperbole at that point. It has to be supported by some measure of facts.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And this last credo here is one that Alex and I take very seriously, and it's don't take yourself too seriously. Art criticism is always more a reflection of the viewer than the artist, right? And so, and that is something that we take seriously. It's something that I really do is, man, I don't really know much of anything. Like there's so many people that have more knowledge to offer. There's so many podcasts out there that have so much more to offer in terms of historical Godzilla knowledge. That's undoubtable, right? There's so many I could give recommendations for. That's not what we're really trying to do on our own show, and it's not what I try to do. Like that for me, that's not actually the most entertaining show either. I want to hear someone's take on it, right? I want to hear why you think the way that you do. That tells me more about you as a person. And it's really just kind of, if you can add your own unique spin and your own unique flavor to something, well, then I'm going to find it interesting. Nobody can do you but you. And I would encourage everyone to take ourselves just a little bit less seriously, especially in this whole online podcasting Twitter sphere.
Oh man, can I give you, I know you're probably not a real religious man, but can I give you an amen at all of that? Man, you are just, you're speaking hashtag truth at that point. So yeah. I think that there is a point where you can get so high on your own opinion that even though, or I should say, you get so high on your own knowledge of a particular film or genre that even though you may be correct, it just becomes off-putting to people, right?
Yes.
And it
doesn't help. It doesn't help that we're online, like, and we're trying to express our opinion. That's what Twitter is, right? Twitter is a platform where you are supposed to have a strong opinion because you have to in what is it, 280 characters or less. You have to have this strong opinion to express yourself succinctly. You're going to have to. It's not a place for nuance. And then usually sometimes what happens is we put ourselves so much into these opinions, into these 280 characters, that we end up becoming more and more these strong opinions, where we might not have started so extreme. Because we put ourselves out there and we have to be extreme to make our point, we end up becoming more extreme. And that's what happens.
You sort of have to become the extreme version of yourself to cut through some of the noise, because let's just face it, Twitter is a noisy place, right? And there's only so much you can say in 280 characters. And I think you're right about I like that you mentioned nuance, because a lot of the meaning behind someone's tweet gets lost because, there's only so much you can say in 280 characters, unless you do like a tweet storm, but not everyone reads the whole thread, as we've learned before. So
yes.
Yeah.
And also I just think, and this is maybe a little side tangent, but I don't know. I in my account, I'm not a big social media user.
Right.
I'm really not. And so I handle our podcast account, and I have my own personal account. And on my personal account, I never tweet. And my podcasting account, I very rarely tweet, and it's just always in relation to Godzilla or Kaiju or monsters. It's just I don't. Sometimes we get out of our realms of our community, and when you do that, you're setting yourself up. You're setting yourself up. And I'm talking, like just in film criticism. Like if we're in this film community, let's talk about film. But maybe that's just me.
Yeah, I see what you're saying. So I'm going to ask you a tough question. So what you're saying is sort of, if you're like, take Monsters versus Men for a second, for example, your guys' podcasting account. If that's what you came here for, then you're saying it's probably not a great idea to stray away from that into certain areas that could be considered very divisive.
That's in general where we get. That's where I'm at. That's where I'm at, and that's a position that pleases nobody,
right?
Honestly, because there's always somebody that wants you to say more, wants you to say less. To me, it's just better to stick with what I'm doing. And the reason I say that is because we all have lives outside of our Twitter handles. On Twitter, all we are is we're talking heads.
We're avatars.
We're equating believing and speaking with action, right? And what I tweet does not define who I am or the actions that I'm taking as a human being on this side of the screen. It just doesn't. I have a whole life and a whole career and a whole mission of my life outside of Twitter, and sometimes it just feels like whenever if I say too much or if I'm saying too little, it just all feels like this show that we're trying to put on to show how
it's
righteous that we can become,
it's virtue
or it's not just that, it is virtue signaling, but and virtue signaling, like, you can be like, if you are always talking about these things all the time, like, that's great. Like honestly, like, I'm cool with that. Like, and honestly, like, when we're talking about these big issues of the day, I am on board 100%. But at the same time, it's like, if I say something and I've never said anything before about any other issue of the day,
it doesn't feel genuine at that point.
What it doesn't feel genuine. It's like, and the community doesn't need me to say anything. You should, if you listen to our show, you know the type of people, or you know a little bit better the type of people we are than just our Twitter handle, right? So it is tricky. It is tricky to navigate, but I think there's a way to do it, and there's a way to not do it, and we just have to be smart, and we have to be willing to enter that dialogue with people outside of Twitter in our real lives. That's the key for me, and what I continually try to do.
And I think you're spot on. It's just, we're more than just our avatars, right? I mean, we're real people. We're real people with real lives, and what we do outside of just this fandom is what really actually matters. As my dad would say, our actions speak louder than our words.
Yeah.
And I think that you guys show that.
Yeah.
I think y'all's actions, both online and offline, show that you deserve to be considered some pillars in this community.
I aim to be somebody that is honestly here for you, right? That is, like, we want to be a podcast that is here for you, that is consistent. The one thing I would say about our podcast, if I'm bragging about it for a second, is we have we are coming up on our year anniversary from releasing episode 1. And since that year anniversary, we've released an episode every single Monday since that first episode. And we haven't missed a week. And I think that comes down to, honestly, Alex and I's friendship. But at the same time, like, it's also, we know, like, people that listen to us, it's like that. It comes back all the way to the beginning of our conversation, where it comes back to comfort food. Like, we are there for people. Not that our podcast is going to be there for people forever, obviously, but in this moment, like, we are here for our listeners that will expect us to have a podcast every Monday and are, want to listen to us on their drive into work on Monday morning. We're here for you on Twitter, like, whoever, if you're wanting to talk and have a conversation. There's not a single person that sends us a message request or tries to have a conversation. We're like, not you, man. That's just not us. Like, we want to have those conversations, and we want to open this community up so that we have all these sorts of conversations with all aspects of the community. We don't want to limit ourselves in any way, shape, or form with the conversations that we're having.
Yeah, I mean, it's fantastic. And I think, this has been a really, I had high hopes for this conversation anyway, but this has exceeded those expectations. I will say that. So thank you. First, thank you so much for having this conversation with me. It was a real pleasure. But before we wrap this up, I do have one little portion of this that I want to touch on because on Twitter, I did ask some of our friends to submit to us some questions, right? I wanted to do sort of an AMA style with you, so that folks can get to know you just a little bit better. So if you've got a few more minutes to spend with me, we can go through those. Okay.
Let's do it.
So this first one comes from Nathan, and it says, also, as one lit nerd / teacher to another, is Moby Dick a kaiju? Why or why not?
I would say that this gets into a whole definition of what is a kaiju, but yes, I think Moby Dick is a kaiju, but I never would have called it a kaiju before I knew what a kaiju was. So I never would have called it a kaiju before this year. So I think size, scale, and uniqueness, it checks all the boxes for me. So I would definitely call it a kaiju, but would I generally say, like, most people would call it a kaiju? No.
Okay. The next question we got was from our friend David. And it says, what film auteur would you like to see tackle a giant monster film?
That's a tough question. That's a tough question because, I mean, you've got, and also you have to think about, well, what would I consider an auteur, as David uses that word. So, and you got to think about someone like, Jordan Peele. But you also have to think he might even be a little mainstream to call him an auteur, and maybe too obvious of a choice. So there are a couple of people that come to mind. I think one is this director, Jeff Nichols. Jeff Nichols, he directed some really low budget character driven dramas. Take Shelter, Mud, Shotgun Stories. Most of them have Michael Shannon in him. But he recently directed, I think, his latest film. Well, he directed Loving was his latest film, I believe. And then there was a sci-fi film he directed called Midnight Special. Is that right? Which I didn't like. I actually didn't like his first array foray. Is that the word?
Foray. Is it foray?
Into
there we go.
Foray. Yeah. Into I didn't enjoy his first foray into science fiction films. But if you're looking for something like a kaiju film that could bring character drama into a bigger story, and also with like this sense of potential dread, he would be a great choice. Another great choice would be Trey Edward Schultz. Recently, he released this movie called Waves, which is it's not a kaiju film by any means. But before that, he released another movie called It Comes at Night. I believe it's called. And that's another film where I think it would end up more focused on the humans than the monsters, but I think that would be okay. And it would just add tension. And then one last one. I know I'm cheating
fine.
here, but I think I would say there's a Korean director, Lee Chang-dong is his name. And he did this movie Burning, and he's done this movie Poetry. He would bring kind of this off the wall element like Guillermo del Toro would, right? Like someone that is just really creative. You're not sure what you're going to get, and you don't know what you're going to like. You don't know what to expect in the film. So those are three thoughts of filmmakers that I would consider modern day auteurs.
Let me ask you really quickly, as you were naming off all of those fantastic artists there, it really made me think for a second. What, in your opinion, what would an Adam Sandler directed kaiju film look like?
Michael. You know my disdain. You know my disdain for Adam Sandler as an actor. I can't even imagine him as a director.
He is, in fact, a director.
And let me
get a director's credit.
Let me just clear the air real quick with Adam Sandler. Okay, I think here's the reason I don't love Adam Sandler, and the reason I am not his biggest defender is because I think he actually has a whole lot of talent. And I think he squanders that talent by making less than mediocre films over and over again to get a paycheck. But that's just my 2 cents.
That is probably the most snobbish answer I think I've heard in a while.
And I know you are an Adam Sandler fan.
Well, okay, I can.
You love Adam Sandler's filmography of the past 10 years. I know you, Michael.
It is a guilty pleasure. I will have to admit. That. So speaking of snobbishness, Nathan also wanted to know, what film have you seen that you could be the most snobbish about?
Well, I think this sets me just like the Adam Sandler setup, where you set me up to be a bad guy. Now every Adam Sandler fan that listens to your podcast is gonna despise me now. I did watch an Adam Sandler movie recently. I thought was great. It was called The Meyerowitz Story. Stories. Definitely recommend it. It's on Netflix. Check it out. But the film snob question sets me up to be a bad guy, because I don't think we're really film snobs about good films. Film snobs are called film snobs because they look down upon what they consider bad films. So I will turn the tables a little bit on Nathan and say that I will be a film snob by saying everyone should love a specific movie. And I think everybody in our fandom that likes genre films should like the movie Children of Men.
I have not seen it. I have heard it. I've heard of it, but I've not seen it yet. And, speaking of Children of Men, though, a little birdie told me that your taste in good movies came from the moment that your best friend Alex showed you that movie.
Yeah, okay. Like Alex would love to take credit for my exquisite taste in film, but that's just wrong. Alex doesn't even like most of the films that I like, so he did. I will give Alex credit for introducing me to that movie specifically, but that's about all the credit that he gets.
All right, that's fair. I think that's absolutely fair. And speaking of Alex, another question we got from our good friend David says, and most importantly, how much would it take to kick Alex from the podcast?
I mean, it wouldn't take much. Are you offering?
Well, you and I would have to line up on some films, specifically some Heisei films, before I would consider it. But I would not write off. Okay. I wouldn't write it off.
I understand. I try not. I know which film you're talking about. And it is probably my least favorite Godzilla film, but that's okay. It's Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla 2, the worst Godzilla film, the worst Heisei film of them all. It's okay, Michael. We can agree to disagree there. And in all seriousness, if Alex wasn't the co-host of the podcast, there wouldn't be a podcast. So he does so much of the legwork on our podcast that honestly, like it wouldn't happen without him.
Well, I've just got a few more questions, but the next one comes in from your friend Corey, which goes by the name Gojira27 Noir on Twitter. And Corey simply asks, the bigger question is, why is the better half not the one that goes on first? And I think this is probably a question for me. Well, Corey, simply because Eric accepted my invitation first.
We have talked about this. We've talked about having this conversation for a while now.
We absolutely have. I think it was simply just, I was talking with Alex the other day, and I think it was just the subject matter that I wanted to talk to you about was a little bit more specific than maybe what I could talk to Alex about. I'm still trying to figure out the topic for him and I to discuss. But Corey, I will have Alex on this show. The next one comes from our friend Henry, and he asks, what is the airspeed velocity of an unladen swallow?
Henry. He knows I'm not a biology guy, and so he is just trying to trip me up, and I will not take the bait on that one. I do not know Henry, and I do not pretend to know. So I will not pretend to be knowledgeable about something that I am completely ignorant about.
Henry, I'm going to ask you a question. Is it an African or a European swallow? So when you answer that, it does make a huge difference. Yeah. A huge difference. So when you can answer that, then maybe Eric and I will answer.
Yeah. Then maybe I could answer your question. Until then, though, I mean, you got to be more specific.
Right.
Henry.
Exactly. Come on, Henry, get it together. We know you can, as a Kaiju fan, you can do better. So a couple more. David asks, did Manila breastfeed, or was it strictly on the bottle, or was he strictly on the bottle?
Oh man. There is not such thing as too much information on this podcast, apparently. So I was going to say that we are a strictly breastfeeding family. So in our household, Manila probably was a breastfeeder.
Okay. All right. Anonymous. It says anonymous. I don't know who anonymous is. But is it true that Ping Pong Playa is your favorite comedy film of all time?
Ping pong. It's one of them, and oh boy, yeah, Ping Pong Player. I have not watched that movie since probably 2009 with
I've never seen it.
Alex.
Never seen it.
So that anonymous question seems very specific from a very anonymous person.
A very anonymous and very suspicious person. Indeed.
Yes.
Indeed. So the last question is, and this one is from David. He says, so I heard y'all are getting the Kendrick brothers on your show to discuss your favorite film, Fireproof. Is this true?
Oh my gosh. Oh my goodness. Okay. Fireproof. If we want to talk about a movie that I can be an absolute film snob about, it's I have seen Fireproof. That's the thing. I have seen Fireproof. I disapprove of Fireproof, but not as much as I disagree with God's Not Dead and God's Not Dead 2. And I guess there's a God's Not Dead 3 potentially. Those movies can burn for so many reasons.
Oh boy. To be fair, I had to make sure that Fireproof was the movie that I was thinking of.
This is the one where Fireproof is the movie, if I'm correct, it's the movie where the firefighter has a porn addict or porn addiction and has to fight for his marriage. Movie. Is this correct?
Yeah.
Kirk Cameron, Left Behind. Yeah. Oh yeah, I have seen way too many Kirk Cameron movies in my life. Just to let you know,
I've seen. I'm right there with you, and as a evangelical Christian myself, even I cringe at some of them.
Well, I'm telling you, man, as an evangelical Christian yourself, God's Not Dead is probably the worst testimony that evangelical Christianity has going for it right now. So.
Oh boy. So maybe this conversation deserves a part 2. I'm not quite sure yet.
All I know is that I'm about to get a bunch of hate mail from Adam Sandler and God's Not Dead fans. That's all the evangelical Christian Godzilla Twitter is about to light me up, and
because there are some of us out there. There are. So Eric, thank you so much, man, for coming on the show. It was a pleasure for sure.
Absolutely. Yeah, thanks for having me, man.
For sure. It went a little bit longer than I wanted it to. I know you're a little bit, in all seriousness, I know that you're a family man. You're a little tight for time, but I really do appreciate you coming on and talking with me. Yeah. So before we go, do you want to do any shameless plugs?
Well, we have talked about my podcast, I think, plenty on your show. If this is the first time you've ever heard of us, though, check it out. Monsters vs. Men. You can find us on Twitter at MVM_pod, on Instagram at the same handle. We'd love to hear from you. Once again, we are a very consistent podcast that loves to just talk about giant monsters and look at them in new and interesting ways.
For sure. It's been a really interesting ride listening to you guys over the last year. Looking forward to it. So until next time, dear listener, we'll catch you next time. Peace.
Thank you for listening to the Kaiju Groupie Podcast, a podcast produced and hosted by Michael Hamilton using redcircle.com. If you enjoyed today's episode and want to continue this conversation, please email me directly at kaijugroupiepod@gmail.com. Also, follow us on social media by joining the Kaiju Groupie Facebook group, on Twitter at Kaiju Groupie Pod, and on Instagram at The Kaiju Groupie. The show is available on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, or wherever you find your favorite giant monster podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review the show. This will help spread the word to other kaiju and tokusatsu fans, and if you do, I promise I'll read your comments on the next episode. All film, audio clips, and graphics belong to their respective copyright holders with no infringement being intended or implied. So until next time, I'm Michael, the Kaiju Groupie, signing off.